Shalom. I'm Messianic Pastor Michael Brown, and I want to welcome you to session 33 of this series, Messiah Yeshua's Life, a Messianic Jewish perspective based on a harmony of the Gospels. In this session, we will continue to look at paragraph 14 in Dr. Fruchtenbaum's book he entitled In Bethlehem, and I've added Magi Visit Young Yeshua. In part 1, we looked at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. It says, Now after Yeshua was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. So in part 1, we looked at the significance of Yeshua being born in Bethlehem, the identity and background of King Herod, the identity of the Magi, and why the Magi would have been coming to Jerusalem asking about the one born King of the Jews. So you can go back and watch part 1 to see that. So now let's pick up in part 2. Look at Matthew 2, verse 3. And when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now the Greek verb tarasso means greatly perturbed, deeply troubled. Dr. Kenan Curitan writes this. He says, apparently there was a popular belief cited by several ancient historians that stars, comets, and other astral phenomena heralded the births of people destined for greatness. And these Magi apparently held this view as well. All right, I stopped his quote. Roman rulers and Herod, as a ruler under them, were fearful or at least apprehensive of astrology and things involving the celestials because they believed they were a portent usually of something bad for them. Now Herod felt threatened by this star and the birth of a child, especially because he was ruling as king of the Jews, and he had no intention of stepping aside for some baby or child who had just been born to replace him as king. Let me quote Dr. Kenan Curitan again. He says, on top of that, several Roman historians record that there was a lot of speculation during that time about a world ruler who would come from an eastern province which could include Judea. All right, I'm stopping his quote. Now, as to why all Jerusalem was troubled as well by this, if Herod was troubled, then others in Jerusalem would have been troubled. Why? Due to the fact they knew Herod was paranoid, and they didn't know how he might react to this and what trouble he may cause for them as a result. Maybe also this unusual retinue, of the Magi and those with them might have been quite large, showing up from the east in itself could have also troubled them. Not knowing what all this would mean and result and as a result of it. As well, the people hated Herod. So if they knew that there was a birth of a king of the Jews, that might encourage some of them to finally rebel against Herod, and this would have caused more problems for everyone. All right, let's look back at the screen again. So gathering together all the chief Kohanim, or priests, and scribes of the people, Herod inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They, that's the Kohanim and the scribes, said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what was written by the prophet. And now they're going to be referring to Micah 5:2 in the English. It's Micah 5:1 in the Hebrew. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. John 7, verse 27 shows us that some of the common people at that time didn't think that anyone would know where the Messiah would be from or appear from. Maybe they just thought he would appear out of nowhere. But notice that these religious leaders, the Kohanim, the priests and the scribes, correctly knew that the Messiah was to be born, for one thing, not just appear out of nowhere. And also, he was to be born in particular in Bethlehem, or in Hebrew, Bethlehem. That means house of bread. And that was where King David had been born. Also, we see in John 7, verse 42, that some of the multitudes were aware of this fact, that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. Okay, let's look at this screen. Now, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum points out, and I got this from his book, how the New Testament, or the Brit Hadashah, quotes the Hebrew. In other words, quoting from the Hebrew scriptures. And he puts basically the four categories or types of quotations that we see in the Brit Hadashah, or the New Testament. All right, I'm continuing to quote Dr. Fruchtenbaum here. Later Judaism concluded that there is a fourfold meaning of Scripture which is indicated in the word PaRDeS. PaRDeS is Hebrew for orchard, garden, or paradise. Okay, so each of the consonants in PaRDeS represents a different way that the rabbis would quote or refer to a passage in the Hebrew Scriptures. All right, the first one, as you see in the chart there, is Peshat. Now, Peshat is the simple or literal meaning. In other words, it's like a literal quote, or in other words, that, or maybe they're summarizing the words, but actually they're just referring to the surface meaning of that prophecy or passage and just saying, well, this is in fulfillment of that, as an example. Okay, the second one is Remez. And Remez means hint or suggestion. So the meaning is arbitrarily imported into it, and I'll explain about that on another occasion. The third one is a drosh. Okay, and that's, you've probably heard the name drosh. It means exposition or investigation. That's where, when they reference a passage in the Hebrew Scriptures, they're basically giving the meaning of it deduced by investigation. And then number 4 is sod, and that means in Hebrew secret, hidden, or mystery. So in that case, it's given the theosophic meaning. Okay, let me stop sharing that. Now, being Jewish, the New Testament writers referred to the Hebrew Scriptures in the same 4 ways the rabbis did in their writings. In other words, what I showed you in the chart. And this shows that they were familiar with these different approaches in referring to Scriptures. Every Old Testament or Hebrew Scripture quotation or reference found within the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, always falls into one of these 4 categories that I just went through. In fact, Matthew chapter 2 has examples of each of the 4 categories. So as I go through Matthew chapter 2, I'll point out each of those 4. Now, when interpreting Scripture, the correct procedure is not simply to interpret the old by the new, so to speak, as replacement theology insists. The correct procedure is to first see what the original quotation means in its own context. Once that's determined, it can also be determined in which of the 4 categories this quotation or reference belongs. When interpreting an Old Testament passage, application can even be made to a modern situation without having to imply that that application was the original intent of the author. There's equally no need to conclude that the New Testament changes or reinterprets the Old Testament. Now, I was quoting Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum there. So let me just say, so Matthew 2, verses 5 through 6, where Matthew refers back to Micah 5:2. In other words, he's reporting what these scribes and the priests, told King Herod. When he's referring back to Micah 5:2, that is an example of Peshat, a literal prophecy where they're saying this is the literal fulfillment of it. So we see, again, in Matthew chapter 2, Matthew saying that Yeshua's birth in Bethlehem of Judea was a literal fulfillment of this prophecy in Micah 5, verse 2, that the one from eternity, referring to the Messiah, was to be born in Bethlehem Ephrathah. Now, I want to point out that there are some slight differences between what Matthew reported or summarized, what the religious leaders had told King Herod from Micah 5:2, and what the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Scriptures actually said in Micah 5:2. You may have never noticed this, and that's why I want to point it out. In case somebody brings this up to you, you won't be shocked by it when you see that. Okay, so look at this. I've got on this screen, I've got the English translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, in other words, from the Masoretic text of Micah 5:2. And then I've got what Matthew said in Matthew 2 verse 6. And I want you to notice there's some slight differences. Not major, just slight differences. All right, let's go through, and then I'm going to explain them. Okay, so let's look at the English translation of the Hebrew Scriptures in Micah 5, verse 2. This is from the New American Standard Translation. So it says, "But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity." Now, I want you to notice in Matthew 2, verse 6, when he refers back to that, how he makes some slight changes. He says, "And you, Bethlehem," he doesn't say of Ephrathah, but now he says, "land of Judah. By no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler," and notice he says, "will shepherd my people Israel." Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that sometimes anti-missionaries or critics of the Scriptures will point out a passage like this. And they'll say, "Look at that. The Berachah Shar of the New Testament's not reliable. It's misquoting from the Hebrew Scriptures." All right, now let me just say, that is not true. Matthew is not misquoting here from Micah 5:2. Matthew did something very Jewish here that the rabbis would even do back in biblical times and even after that. Matthew was not intending to give a word-for-word translation from the Hebrew into the Greek of Micah 5, verse 2. Matthew did, you could say, like a midrash or a sermonic teaching and interpretation of Micah 5, verse 2, for the purposes of his readers of his gospel account. I'm going to refer to a Jews for Jesus article which points out what Matthew changed from the Masoretic text for his purposes of his readers. All right, I'm quoting here. And so Matthew alters Bethlehem Ephrathah to Bethlehem, land of Judah, which is the same place, and specifies which of the two Bethlehems was meant from whom the Messiah was expected to come. Then Matthew alters "too little to be among the clans of Judah" changes it to "by no means least among the leaders of Judah." Now, in the original text, referring to the Hebrew scriptures, Micah emphasized the insignificance of Bethlehem. Yet Micah's point is that although it is a small town of no account, yet it will see greatness when it produces the Messiah, the ruler in Israel. So Matthew shortcuts that to make the point of Bethlehem's ultimate greatness, which is Micah's point as well. Third, Matthew changes clans to leaders. This too is a sermonic type of change. From the clans come the leaders. So Matthew simply wants to emphasize the point that Bethlehem will produce a leader or ruler, perhaps to contrast this messianic leader or ruler with the oppressive Roman rulers currently in place. And finally, Matthew's last line, where he mentions about the shepherd, is from 2 Samuel 5, verse 2, a verse that indicates King David will be the true shepherd of Israel. In this way, by emphasizing ruler previously and now citing a verse about a shepherd, Matthew may be contrasting the Messiah with both Roman rulers and the leaders of Israel, who Yeshua was later to say were false shepherds. Okay, let's look at the next two verses. Look at Matthew 2, verses 7 through 8. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him." Right. No, that's not at all why he was wanting to do it. So they told Herod that they first started seeing the star 2 years earlier. Notice that upon hearing the King of the Jews was born and finding out he was to be born in Bethlehem, Herod didn't go himself. He just sends the Magi go and check it out. I suspect they probably wondered, well, why didn't Herod go himself to find the king, to worship him himself? So they probably started suspecting Herod didn't have good intentions. And then this was going to be confirmed by a later dream mentioned in verse 12. You know, Herod represents how someone could react to hearing someone else to be their king. You know, we want to be king of our own life. But God says we have a king, and we need to humble ourselves and recognize the Lord as our king. Also notice that the priests and scribes who told him the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem don't even bother themselves to go check it out either, which speaks negatively of their spirituality. I mean, think about it. The Magi could have easily have traveled 1,000 miles from Persia to see this king of the Jews back in Israel. They overcame distance, difficulties, dangers. There was a lot of dangers traveling in ancient times like that. They overcome distance, difficulty, and danger to see this king of the Jews who had been born. These religious leaders weren't even willing to travel 6 measly miles to check out this newborn king, apparently the promised Messiah. I share all that just to say that reminds us that God's truth, in this case the promised Jewish Messiah, could be right there, could be readily available for people. And if they're not really open to the truth or under conviction, they won't even bother to check it out, even if it would be easy for them to do it. Think about it. People won't read a tract or visit a congregation or even read a Bible that they already have if they're not motivated, if they're not under conviction to want to look at it. So we need to pray for people to be convicted of their need so that they want to honestly look into the truth of Yeshua. In other words, to look into the evidence. Isn't it interesting that the star led the Magi not initially to where Yeshua was born, but instead to Jerusalem where Herod was? And instead, it would be the biblical prophecy of where the Messiah was to be born that led them to start going to Bethlehem. And then the star confirmed that and led them to the actual house where Yeshua was. So notice that God used here a star and also dreams to direct them. I like this statement by Dr. James Merritt. He says, a star got them to Jerusalem, but it took Scripture to get them to Bethlehem and to Yeshua. Think about it. A star won't lead you to Yeshua, but Scripture will. This reminds us that if people will favorably respond to what the Scriptures have, then God will confirm it to them. In our story, he confirmed it with the star, guiding them there as well and to the very home where the Messiah was. Okay, well, we're going to stop part 2 at this point. And let me just say, if you like the teachings, please choose like on our YouTube channel for the teachings. And please share them with others you think would enjoy them too. Next time, we will conclude paragraph 14 with part 3, looking at Matthew 2, verses 9 through 12. In Bethlehem, Magi visit young Yeshua. I hope you will join us for that. Till then, shalom.